the radio that never slept, a continuous frequency transmitting hope and fear. In the winter of 1951, somewhere along the border between East and West Germany, a radio operator named Klaus Adler sat alone in a concrete bunker, wearing headphones that had not left his ears in 48 hours. The station identification never changed, the music never stopped, and the voice that spoke between songs always sounded calm, familiar, almost kind. It called itself Morning Star, and it broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause, without acknowledgement, without origin. Klaus had been assigned to monitor it, to transcribe its content, to identify patterns or codes hidden within the transmission. But after 2 days of constant exposure, he noticed something far more disturbing than any encrypted message. He had begun to believe everything it said. The signal first appeared in late 1950, detected by American and British intelligence units stationed across occupied Germany. It was not jamming enemy broadcasts, nor was it transmitting propaganda in the traditional sense. No angry speeches, no calls to arms, no political doctrine shouted into the void. Instead, it played music, soft and pleasant, interspersed with a single male voice that spoke slowly, gently, as if addressing an old friend. The content was mundane: weather reports, farming advice, recipes, poetry, philosophical musings about peace and community. It felt harmless, even comforting, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. By early 1951, intelligence officers across Western Europe had compiled over 300 hours of recordings, and analysts had begun to notice something unusual. Listeners who tuned in casually reported feeling unusually calm, even drowsy after exposure. Those who listened regularly described vivid dreams, a growing sense of nostalgia for a past they could not quite remember, and an inexplicable trust in the voice itself. Soldiers on night watch began requesting permission to listen, claiming it helped them stay awake, though officers noted they seemed less alert, more compliant, slower to respond to orders. Civilians in border towns left their radios on throughout the night, as if the absence of the broadcast would create an unbearable silence. The operation that followed was given the code name Nightingale, a joint effort between American psychological warfare specialists and British intelligence to investigate, decode, and ultimately neutralize the Morning Star transmission. What they discovered was not a simple propaganda tool, but something far more sophisticated. A sustained psychological intervention designed not to change what people thought, but to change how they felt about thinking at all. The broadcast was not meant to convince, it was meant to comfort, to soothe, to create dependency, and in doing so, to slowly erode the capacity for critical resistance. It was a frequency designed to be trusted, and trust, once embedded deep enough, could be weaponized in ways no political argument ever could. The first field reports came from occupied towns near the inner German border, places where refugees and displaced persons gathered in makeshift camps, living in uncertainty, trauma still fresh from the war. Aid workers noticed that families who kept radios tuned to Morning Star seemed quieter, more passive, less likely to ask questions or complain about conditions. Children fell asleep faster when the broadcast was playing, adults appeared less anxious, less likely to resist relocation orders or challenge authority. At first, this was seen as a benefit, a calming influence in an otherwise volatile environment. But when intelligence officers attempted to conduct routine interviews with these populations, they found something troubling. People could not clearly recall what they had heard on the broadcast, yet they spoke about it with affection, describing it as familiar, trustworthy, essential. Psychologists brought in to analyze the recordings identified several techniques embedded within the structure of the transmission. The pacing of speech was unusually slow, with long pauses between sentences, creating a rhythm similar to hypnotic induction. The music selected was exclusively in major keys, with tempos matching resting heart rates, promoting relaxation and reducing physiological arousal. The voice itself was recorded with a slight echo, giving it a dreamlike quality, as if it were coming from inside the listener's own mind rather than from an external source. Most significantly, the content followed a pattern of repetition without redundancy. Core messages about safety, community, and trust were woven throughout every segment, but never stated directly, always implied, always felt rather than understood. One of the psychologists, a man named Dr. Emil Hartmann, had spent the final years of the war studying propaganda techniques used by both Allied and Axis powers. He understood that traditional propaganda relied on repetition of slogans, appeals to emotion, and the creation of external enemies. Morning Star used none of these tactics. Instead, it operated on a principle Hartmann described as ambient persuasion, a method by which beliefs are not argued but atmospherically cultivated, where the listener is not told what to think but is gradually conditioned to feel safe only when listening, and anxious when the signal is absent. It was not a message, it was an environment, and humans adapt to environments far more readily than they accept arguments. As Nightingale progressed, intelligence units began tracing the signal's origin. Direction-finding equipment suggested it was broadcasting from somewhere deep within Soviet-controlled territory, but the exact location remained elusive. The transmission itself showed signs of technical sophistication unusual for the era. It was broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously, making it difficult to jam without disrupting other communications, and it adapted in real time to atmospheric conditions, shifting power and wavelength to maintain optimal clarity. Whoever was operating Morning Star understood radio propagation at an expert level, and they were committed to ensuring the signal reached as many listeners as possible, regardless of interference. In March of 1951, an experimental counter-operation was launched. British engineers constructed a jamming station designed to disrupt the Morning Star frequency without affecting other broadcasts. The jamming was activated at midnight, and within hours intelligence officers received reports of unusual distress among civilian populations in affected areas. People described feeling uneasy, unable to sleep, experiencing what they called a sense of loss, as if something essential had been taken from them. Some attempted to find the signal on other frequencies, others became irritable, argumentative, restless. Within 72 hours, the jamming was quietly discontinued, not because it failed technically, but because the psychological effects of removing the broadcast were deemed more destabilizing than allowing it to continue. This was the true genius of Morning Star. It had created a dependency so subtle that even those affected could not articulate what they were dependent on. It was not a craving for information, nor a desire for entertainment, it was a need for the presence of the voice itself, a need that had been cultivated slowly, over weeks and months of passive exposure, until the absence of the broadcast felt like the absence of safety. The signal had become a surrogate for trust in a world where trust had been shattered by war, and removing it did not liberate the listener, it only revealed how deeply the need had been embedded. Dr. Hartmann's final report to Allied intelligence was classified immediately upon submission. In it, he argued that Morning Star represented a new form of psychological warfare, one that did not seek to defeat the enemy through fear or intimidation, but through comfort and dependence. He noted that traditional propaganda could be resisted by skepticism, by distrust of the source, by awareness of manipulation. But Morning Star bypassed these defenses by never presenting itself as propaganda at all. It was simply there, always available, always calm, always kind, and in a world defined by chaos and loss, that presence alone was enough to make it indispensable. The operation continued to expand in scope throughout 1951 and into 1952. Additional monitoring stations were established, more linguists and psychologists were assigned to the project, and experimental broadcasts were tested to see if the same techniques could be replicated for Western purposes. The results were mixed. When American or British teams attempted to create their own soothing broadcasts, listeners reported that they sounded artificial, insincere, too obviously designed to manipulate. The voice of Morning Star, by contrast, had something the imitators lacked: authenticity, or at least the convincing illusion of it. It sounded like someone who genuinely cared, someone who had no agenda beyond offering comfort, and that made all the difference. By mid-1952, intelligence analysts had developed a profile of the likely psychological effects of long-term exposure to Morning Star. Listeners would experience increased passivity, reduced critical thinking, heightened suggestibility, and a generalized sense of dependence on external authority for emotional regulation. They would be less likely to engage in dissent, less motivated to seek alternative sources of information, and more inclined to accept official narratives without question. In essence, they would become ideal subjects for authoritarian control, not because they were afraid but because they were calm, trusting, compliant. Fear could be resisted, comfort could not. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from a series of interviews conducted with former listeners who had been relocated away from areas where the signal could be received. Months after their last exposure, many still described feeling the absence of the broadcast, a vague sense that something was missing, that the world was somehow colder, less safe. Some sought out similar content, tuning into local stations that played soft music or calming voices, but they reported that nothing replicated the effect of Morning Star. It had been unique, irreplaceable, and its absence left a hollow space that no other broadcast could fill. This was not nostalgia, it was withdrawal, a neurological and emotional dependency that persisted long after the signal itself had faded. In the fall of 1952, The decision was made to publicly acknowledge the existence of Morning Star, not as a psychological weapon, but as an unexplained phenomenon, a rogue broadcast of unknown origin. This narrative was carefully constructed to avoid panic while discouraging further listening. Newspapers in Western Germany published brief articles describing the signal as likely originating from a malfunctioning Soviet transmitter, possibly automated, with no intentional content or purpose. Citizens were advised to avoid prolonged listening due to potential interference with emergency broadcasts. The truth, of course, was never disclosed, and the operation to monitor and analyze Morning Star continued in complete secrecy. By 1953, the signal had evolved. The voice began incorporating new elements: stories, personal anecdotes, recollections of childhood, reflections on memory and identity. These additions were not random. They followed patterns identified in psychological research on nostalgia and emotional bonding. The stories were designed to feel universal, as if they could belong to anyone, and listeners began to report feeling that the voice understood them, that it knew their experiences, their fears, their hopes. This was the final stage of dependency. The listener no longer simply trusted the voice, they felt known by it, and that sense of being understood created a bond far stronger than any argument or ideology ever could. Intelligence reports from 1953 noted that some listeners had begun referring to the voice as a friend, a companion, even a family member. They spoke of it with warmth and affection, describing how it helped them through difficult nights, how it made them feel less alone. In interviews, when asked why they listened, they could not always articulate a reason. They simply said it felt right, it felt necessary, it felt like home. This was not a rational decision, it was an emotional one, and emotions, once conditioned, are far more resistant to change than beliefs. The operation to counter Morning Star was eventually abandoned in 1954, not because the signal stopped, but because the cost of jamming it, both technically and psychologically, was deemed too high. The broadcast continued uninterrupted for years thereafter, its influence spreading slowly, quietly into populations across Eastern Europe and beyond. Intelligence agencies tracked its effects, documented its methods, and in some cases, adapted its techniques for their own purposes. The lessons learned from Morning Star became foundational to the development of modern psychological operations, informing everything from public service announcements to entertainment programming to the ambient soundscapes of public spaces. What made Morning Star so effective was not its content, but its presence. It did not argue, it did not persuade, it did not demand. It simply existed, always available, always calm, always there. And in a world where certainty had been destroyed, where trust had been broken, where every institution and ideology had failed, that simple, constant presence became a source of comfort so powerful that it could shape behavior, belief, and identity without ever stating a single explicit command. It was control disguised as kindness, authority hidden within reassurance, and it worked precisely because it never revealed itself as manipulation. The final intelligence summary on Morning Star, declassified in part decades later, concluded with a single observation: the most effective form of control is not fear, but comfort. Fear can be resisted, questioned, overcome. Comfort, by contrast, is welcomed, embraced, sought out. A population that is afraid will eventually rebel. A population that is comfortable will remain compliant indefinitely. Morning Star understood this, and in understanding it, demonstrated a form of psychological warfare more sophisticated, more subtle, and ultimately more dangerous than any that had come before. Klaus Adler, the radio operator who first monitored the broadcast, was removed from his post in early 1952 after exhibiting signs of what military psychiatrists described as dependency syndrome. He had become unable to work without the broadcast playing in the background, grew agitated when asked to listen to other frequencies, and expressed genuine distress at the thought of the signal being silenced. He was reassigned to administrative duties and underwent months of what was then called reconditioning, a process designed to break the psychological attachment formed during his exposure. He never fully recovered. For the rest of his life, he reported feeling as though something was missing, a presence he could not name, a voice he could still hear in the silence. That was the legacy of Morning Star. Not a change in what people believed, but a change in what they needed. It did not rewrite memory or ideology, it rewrote comfort itself, making the listener dependent on an external source for emotional stability, for a sense of safety, for the feeling that they were not alone. And once that dependency was established, it became self-sustaining, invisible, impossible to fully remove. The voice was gone, but the need remained, and that need could be exploited, redirected, used. It was a form of control that did not announce itself, did not justify itself, did not even acknowledge itself. It simply was, and in being, it shaped the world. Decades later, researchers studying the effects of ambient media, of background noise, of constant connectivity, would rediscover the principles first demonstrated by Morning Star. They would find that humans adapt to continuous stimulation, that silence becomes uncomfortable, that the absence of a familiar signal creates anxiety. They would observe that populations exposed to constant media develop dependencies not on specific content, but on the presence of content itself, on the feeling of being surrounded by voices, by information, by reassurance that they are connected, informed, safe. And they would realize that what Morning Star pioneered in the 1950s had become the default condition of modern life. A world where silence is unbearable, where solitude feels like isolation, where the absence of external input is experienced as a void that must be filled. The broadcast itself eventually ceased, or perhaps it simply evolved, scattered across 1,000 frequencies, embedded in 1,000 voices, no longer a single signal but a continuous hum that permeates every moment of waking life. The lessons it taught were never forgotten, and the methods it demonstrated were refined, expanded, perfected. Today, the radio that never sleeps is not a radio at all, it is an entire infrastructure of ambient control, a system so pervasive that it no longer needs to be secret, because it has become invisible, normalized, essential. And so the question remains not whether Morning Star succeeded, but whether it ever truly ended. The signal may have stopped, but the dependency it created, the need it cultivated, the comfort it weaponized, all of these persist, woven into the fabric of how we live, how we think, how we feel. We have become populations that cannot tolerate silence, that seek constant reassurance, that trust the familiar voice even when we cannot remember what it said. We are, all of us, listeners still, waiting for the signal, comforted by its presence, shaped by its absence, controlled not by what we hear, but by the fact that we need to hear it all. Project Morning Star was never just about a radio broadcast. It was about the discovery that the human mind, when subjected to continuous, gentle, soothing input, will adapt not by resisting, but by depending. It will learn to associate that input with safety, with calm, with home. And once that association is made, the input itself becomes a form of control more powerful than any law, any threat, any ideology. Because it is not imposed from outside, it is internalized, wanted, needed. It is control that feels like comfort, authority that sounds like kindness, and in that feeling, that sound, lies the perfect mechanism for obedience. The archive closes here, but the frequency never does. Somewhere, in the static between stations, in the hum of a device left on overnight, in the silence that feels too empty to bear, the signal continues. It has no name now, no origin, no single voice. But it is there, always there, and we are listening whether we know it or not. That is the legacy of Morning Star. Not a weapon that was used and discarded, but a method that was perfected and universalized, until the entire world became a broadcast that never sleeps. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, silence is control.